Not every project is successful, but how do you know when to shut one down? Too many organizations continue operating less effective projects due to sunk cost, donor pressures, or misaligned incentives. In this session, 3 implementers from several organizations across the EA ecosystem will share their learnings from shutting down projects and organizations. First, we have Sarah Eustis-Guthrie. She's a former co-founder and director of research and strategy at Maternal Health Initiative, which she launched through AIM's charity entrepreneurship incubator. She previously worked in government public health policy. Weronika Zurek has been involved in the animal welfare movement since 2017, when she joined Odwarte Klatki at the age of 16. This organization later merged with Anima International. Weronika was lead member of Anima International's campaign to end live carp sales in Poland and is currently studying psychology at Jagiellonian University. Lastly, Carl Fish was the chief technology officer and co-founder of Telis Bioscience and Alvea, where he worked on machine learning-guided protein design and helped Alvea become the fastest biotech startup ever to go from company founding to the launch of a clinical trial. He's currently focused on issues related to AI well-being and moral patienthood. So each will give a short talk, and then we'll have a panel Q&A. If you have questions for the speakers, you can submit them via the Swapcard app, and I'll select a mixture of prepared questions and audience questions. There will also be office hours for all 3 speakers afterwards in Balkan. Okay, as our first speaker, please welcome Sarah Eustis-Guthrie.
Back in April, I shut down the organization that I had co-founded, Maternal Health Initiative. Today, I'd love to tell you about why we started, why we shut down, and some lessons I learned that could be valuable for implementers and grant makers alike. Our organization was incubated through charity entrepreneurship, which identifies highly effective interventions and helps teams pilot them. Our intervention was postpartum family planning, but that's a mouthful, so I'm just going to say postpartum, which involves providing individual and group counseling on family planning to women who've recently given birth. It's a widely recommended intervention because it's riskier for women and their babies if they get pregnant soon after a birth, yet rates of family planning are particularly low in this period. Many studies have shown that these types of programs lead to increased contraceptive uptake, which is generally assumed to lower unwanted and risky pregnancies. To that end, we launched MHI in the fall of 2022 and conducted proof of concept and pilot work in northern Ghana. Our local partners and our recipients had a lot of enthusiasm about the program, but we had quite a few concerns. Based on our in-person visits and our monitoring and evaluation, we had concerns about whether healthcare providers were actually counseling women, about whether that counseling was useful, about whether women were changing their contraceptive uptake, and whether, if so, that was actually reducing the levels of unintended pregnancies. So quite a lot of concerns. Our concerns led us to go back to the research that had inspired our work, and several studies published after we'd been founded showed that in several cases, programs like ours increased contraceptive uptake, but didn't actually reduce risky pregnancies. I'll spare you all the technical details, but it seems to be driven by the fact that many postpartum women in sub-Saharan Africa are protected against pregnancy due to prolonged breastfeeding and prolonged postpartum abstinence. If you're not having sex, you can't get pregnant. That's why we and a few other academics have some hesitations about these programs, though I will say that many people in the field are skeptical of these conclusions, at least for now. So what did we do now that we had these concerns and had these questions about whether the intervention was actually useful? In compressing a months-long process into a short talk, I'm afraid that this makes it seem quite tidy, but I assure you it really was not tidy in the moment. We had a lot of concerns, and we weren't sure how seriously to take any given concern, especially since tons of experts thought that this was an awesome intervention. So what did we do? We created a reevaluation process that took about 2 months. We tried to figure out if there was still a case to be made for our intervention. We went back and we looked at our theory of change, our pitch, our one-year plan, our cost-effectiveness analysis. And if we couldn't make those work, was there still a case to be made for us as an organization, perhaps by pivoting into a new intervention? I'll tell you, we made a lot of Google Docs. We talked to our advisors and experts and our implementation partners. Ultimately, we decided that the program concerns were too pervasive. They were too fundamental to our intervention for us to fix. And we just thought it was simply extremely unlikely that it would be extremely cost-effective. We also just couldn't find a pivot that made sense. We'd picked Ghana for this intervention in part because of its relatively strong healthcare system relative to other countries in the region. But that meant that in turn, the levels of maternal and child mortality weren't the best choice for related interventions. That's what led us to our tentative decision to shut down. After we made that decision, we took some time to sit with it. I personally didn't love how that process felt. I wanted greater certainty. I had to make peace with the fact that I was making a judgment call with the evidence I had available, rather than making some sort of perfect decision with perfect evidence. I learned a lot through this process. I'll now share a few of my biggest lessons. Lesson number 1, regularly monitor your inline impact. Many EA interventions are based on well-run randomized control trials. I don't think that's good enough to ensure that you're actually creating impact. First of all, you need to ensure that you're actually measuring end-line impact rather than something along the way. I think that was one of the crucial mistakes that we made. Number 2, and not everyone agrees with me on this one, I think you need to continue to monitor your end-line impact as you run and scale your programming. Take bed nets. They're often seen as a rock-solid intervention, but it doesn't always work out. Growing insecticide resistance and challenges in net production mean that malaria rates have spiked in some areas that have great net coverage. In Papua New Guinea, for example, incidence went up 80%, and it took years to realize that that was driven in part by problems with net manufacture. If you're not tracking up-to-date data, you risk missing huge problems. I'm not saying that you need to run an RCT every year. They're expensive and difficult, but you should at least be monitoring publicly available data if it's available, running small-scale surveys, and running more robust surveys at least every 5 to 10 years. Lesson number 2, identify and monitor the biggest threats to your model. There is so much to understand about any given intervention, especially more complex ones. Speaking from experience, it's super easy to get lost in adding yet more minute adjustments to your CEA or reading all the latest studies. That was a mistake on our part. In order to avoid getting lost, focus on your intervention's key mechanisms for action, how they might go wrong, and find ways of monitoring them. I would recommend making and then actively using a theory of change and a log frame where you list out the threats to each part of your intervention and how you can mitigate them. That should be at the core of your M&E. It's not just something that you throw in a pitch document. Ask yourself, if your intervention wasn't actually working, would you be able to tell? You can't rely on how things look or casual feedback or proxy metrics. You need robust data. Finally, lesson 3, treat shutting down as an active possibility. Throughout, your attitude makes a huge difference. Effective altruism was inspired in part by the randomista movement, where studies found that many apparently valuable interventions actually didn't work out quite as well as intended. That's normal and expected. Even when a project is picked for its strong evidence base, there's a real chance it might not pan out when scaled. This happened with Evidence Action's No Lean Season in Bangladesh, with No Sugar in Botswana, and of course with all of us here today. You need to approach projects from this perspective. The burden of proof must be on the project to show it's still worth doing, rather than on the skeptic to show that it should be shut down. It's helpful to build this kind of thinking about shutting down projects and the organization itself into your strategic planning, either as part of your project life cycles or in your annual review process. Set performance bars in advance and consult your advisors. Stare into the abyss every once in a while. It's good for the soul. There's way more I could say, and I'm always happy to chat more about this topic. Feel free to come to office hours afterwards or to reach out anytime post-conference if you want to talk about your project and maybe whether you should shut it down. Thank you.
So I'm here to talk about a very wildly different project than Sarah. And as the problem that it relates to is very culture specific, I think it's important to give the cultural background first. So I'm Polish, I live in Poland, and in Poland there's a very strong tradition of buying live fish for Christmas. It's a very specific type of fish, it's always common carp, no other. And it's important to note that 90% of domestic carp production is actually consumed during the Christmas season. So Polish people essentially farm carps only to sell them during Christmas. And in fact, it turns out that a majority of people don't even like the taste of carp, but they do that out of tradition. Now that this has been said, the cruelty related to live fish sales is quite obvious, right? There are problems with conditions of transportation, then the time that the fish spends at a shop or a marketplace. There is a lot of problems when it comes to water quality, the density of fish in a pool, and many others. And finally, the transportation of the live carp to the customers at home and the way it's slaughtered at home is, it leaves much to desire. Of course, an average Polish person is not trained at all in studying fish and slaughtering it. So we can expect that in a majority of cases, this introduces a lot of unnecessary suffering for the fish. Of course, this seems to be quite an obvious problem to fight with. It's very visible. During Christmas season, you can find live fish pretty much anywhere. So it's been a target for animal activists for many years now. In fact, the oldest actions against live carp sales that we have managed to find information about date for late 1990s, so it's been almost 30 years. However, it wasn't until 2010s when Otwarte Klatki, which you may now know as the Polish branch of Anima International, decided to form a coalition with 3 other big organizations to fight the problem together. And the theory of change was that we should tackle the sales of live fish in supermarkets because they quite often sold the highest number of fish. And I must say, this was very successful. In fact, only in the years 2018 and 2019, we managed to get all major supermarket chains in Poland to stop selling live fish. And as opposed to broiler chickens or egg-laying hens, this is a change that is introduced immediately. So if a shop declares to stop selling live fish, then the next Christmas the fish don't appear in the shop. So it's very different to the other problems where we need to wait several years for the changes. Now, the campaign evolved a lot, and of course after the major victories there were no more so important targets to address. So the next plan was to move to marketplaces and make sure that cities do not lend the space in marketplaces for live fish sellers. That sounds great, doesn't it? Well, the problem is that before this even happened, in fact, before we even started working on that, we did a reevaluation of our campaign. And it turned out that it might not be as effective as we thought. The first trigger of the reevaluation was that we came across information that different types of fish eat very different types of food. Carps, which, as I mentioned, is the only type of fish sold live in Poland, is herbivorous, so its feed is primarily plants, while many other types of fish, such as salmons, are fed almost entirely with animal-derived products, such as fish oil or fish meal. To feed one salmon, you need from 150 up to 350 feed fish, which are typically wild fish that were just captured in huge numbers, then when turned into fish oil and fish meal, which was then fed to a salmon so that humans can eat it. That's quite a chain, right? Now, why is it important? Because from anecdotal experience, we knew that people only buy carp because it's available live or because it's a tradition. And we had the suspicion that once live carp is not available, people will have no motivation whatsoever to stick to carp, and they will replace it with carnivorous types of fish. In fact, we observed that in our families, in our friends, we saw that salmon is a more and more common choice during Christmas season. To check whether that was true, we ran a public opinion survey, and it turned out that 1 in 4 adult Polish people were planning to buy live carp for Christmas. And out of those, half of them, if they can't buy live carp, they would buy processed carp. However, 1 in 4, so that's 25%, would buy salmon instead of carp. Of course, that's just declarative measures. We don't know what the real outcome would be. But I'd say these numbers are quite big, so we could expect that if, as a result of our actions, live carp is not available, then people will buy salmon instead. And because, well, it's not so objective, it's hard to quantify animal suffering. But it seemed to us that there is way more suffering involved in raising a salmon. We could, in fact, not only cause little benefit for fish, we could, in fact, cause harm to way more fish. To quantify that in any way, I made like a long calculation, which you can read in details in Effective Altruism Forum. There is a long article named Why Anima International Suspended Its Campaign Against Live Fish Sales in Poland. So you can see all details of how we came up with the number. But in general, we came to the conclusion that if we get 1% of people who buy live carp to switch to buying processed salmon, that would cause an additional 1,007,100 additional fish deaths per year. Now that's quite a number, given that only around 2 million carps are being sold each year in Poland live. So at this point, we started thinking about the campaign from other perspectives also, and we came to the conclusion that, in fact, why are we even conducting this campaign? You know, at this point, first, all the major victories have been achieved. Second, it's not a neglected area, because so many other organizations fight about it, not only in Poland, but also in surrounding countries where the same problem is present. Third, we are not so confident about the final outcome. And in the end, we are speaking about a relatively small number of animals. Because while 2 million carps per year seems to be quite a lot, our other campaigns fight for way higher numbers, such as over 1 billion broiler chickens that are slaughtered each year in Poland. After a long decision process, we decided to shut down the campaign. And because we knew that so many other activists work on very similar actions, we decided to share our insights in the article that I already mentioned in Effective Altruism Forum. We understand that this was a controversial decision, because first, what does it mean for other activists working on the cause? But second, even within Otwarte Klatki, there were some voices that we should continue the campaign anyway, mostly due to its legal value. So it would be an important point in Polish legal system to have some very specific requirements for handling fish, and in this specific case, that the regulations that would not allow for live fish sales. I believe that's the end of facts. Now, when it comes to lessons, I believe, first of all, it's important to note how important culture of the organization is to notice that an action must be shut. It takes a lot of maturity of the organization to first listen to the person who raises the doubt, second, treat it like very seriously, and third, be so focused on effective altruism and on making sure that all actions are effective to really decide to dissolve a campaign and move the resources elsewhere. Second, I've never been a professional activist. I was a volunteer all the time. Even when I was the head of the campaign, even when I was leading the team, I was never a professional. And in many organizations, a volunteer is not listened to as well as a professional activist, which I believe is a great mistake. It is not the only example of a situation when this was important, as historically in Otwarte Klatki, I can recall many situations where volunteers were the ones bringing very important ideas and very important suggestions to the table. A great example of that is when many years ago, a volunteer suggested that we should engage a well-known chef to perform in a campaign against cage-produced eggs. And at first people were like, why would a chef who eats meat engage in such a campaign? But they reached out anyway, and it turns out to be the most watched video ever in the history of the organization. So that's all from my side. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you, Ollie and Weronika and Sarah for sharing. My name is Kyle, as Ollie mentioned, and I'm here today mostly in my capacity as the former Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Alvia, which was an impact-motivated biotech startup that launched in late 2021 amidst the Omicron wave of COVID, with the goal of very rapidly trying to develop new vaccine candidates, particularly ones that could be very easily manufactured and distributed in low and middle income countries. Part of the goal of this project was specifically to develop these COVID vaccines and hopefully get them out into the world in an impactful way. Another piece of this was more broadly trying to push the limits of how quickly we could develop new countermeasures against infectious diseases with an eye toward responding in the future to new potential biological threats. So we launched this project initially as a very short-term focused sprint where we had an idea for this vaccine candidate. We thought that it fit the profile of being potentially very effective, easy to distribute in challenging parts of the world. And amenable to various kinds of acceleration. So we started with this incredibly ambitious goal of, in about 3 months, submitting an application for a clinical trial for this brand new vaccine candidate that we had designed, which was nearly unprecedented. Moderna and Pfizer had very quickly gotten initial clinical trials started for their COVID vaccines, with the benefit of being very well-established companies. We were starting from scratch with a brand new design, with a brand new company, and trying to roughly match their timelines for getting a vaccine into clinical trials. And doing this meant doing a bunch of crazy, ambitious, fast, wild things over the first 3 months of the organization, including expanding our team from around 4 people to around 40 people just in the span of this couple months. But ultimately, we're successful in submitting this clinical trial application and ultimately taking this vaccine candidate very, very quickly into a clinical trial in South Africa. And in doing so, we became, to our knowledge, the fastest startup ever to go from company founding to the launch of a new clinical trial. Despite that, Alvia no longer exists. And despite that accomplishment and many other particularly impressive things that I think Alvia was able to do, we ultimately decided to shut the project down. So I'll talk here a little bit about kind of Alvia's story and what factors led to us ultimately deciding to wind things down, share a little bit about how that's shaped my thinking about kind of projects, impact-motivated projects in general, and particularly decisions about when and whether it makes sense to shut them down and move on. And then we'll go to a panel discussion here. So a big thing that happened in Alvia's case was, as I mentioned, we started as this very focused near-term project with an ambitious goal on the timeline of a couple of months. And when we hit that goal, we had quite a large team. We had raised quite a bit of money at that point, but we didn't have a particularly clear sense of what we were going to do afterward. We knew that we wanted to get this vaccine into clinical trials, but we didn't know for sure whether it would make sense to continue developing that particular vaccine. And if we didn't continue with that vaccine, we didn't have a particularly clear vision of what else it might make sense for us to do. So when we finished that initial sprint and launched that clinical trial, all of a sudden we had a lot of people, a lot of time, a lot of money on our hands, and this very difficult question of what it made sense for this company to pursue. So over about the year that followed, we explored a variety of different options, a variety of different potential answers to that question. First, exploring other potential drugs and vaccines that we might develop and try and accelerate into the clinic in similar ways. We also then explored deploying the expertise that we had developed on accelerated pharmaceutical development to help advance other promising products and find companies who had potentially high impact drugs in their pipeline that we could help get out into the world more quickly. But ultimately, amidst those processes, we struggled to find like a clear win. We struggled to find something that felt like really sort of compelling as a path to impact for the company. Part of that had to do with the specifics of those different strategies that we were pursuing. Part of that also had to do with like big changes and evolutions in both the kind of commercial biotech funding ecosystem and in the kind of philanthropic ecosystem around that time. Which ultimately led to us asking some really difficult questions about whether it made sense for Alvia to exist at all. And in particular, this felt very salient because we had brought together this relatively large team of some exceptionally bright and talented people, and it felt like a very high bar to keep this team of people together working on this project. And we wanted to make very sure that we believed that was the right thing to do. So the executive team launched this process of trying to decide whether we would keep the company open, if so, what that would look like, and if not, how we would wind things down. And ultimately, there were a couple of salient factors for each of us in thinking about that. One of them was the direct impact that we might achieve with this company. We were still broadly focused on accelerated development of drugs and vaccines for biosecurity, and we thought that there was potentially a lot of direct impact to be had by advancing that mission. Another piece of our thinking was around the potential financial resources that we might be able to deploy if Alvia were successful. And thinking of this startup as something of an earning to give possibility in that sense, where even if particular drugs and technologies that we developed weren't necessarily as impactful as we might hope, there is still a possibility that would put us in a position to deploy large amounts of philanthropic resources to other kinds of projects. And then a couple of other factors were counterfactual uses of our time, of the executives' time, and counterfactual uses of the team's time. And it was very salient to us that it's a huge commitment to build a company, and it is a very serious thing to put your work into a major project over a many-year period, and to ask the same of people who are working for you and who are committing their lives in a big way to these projects. And ultimately, each of us, Grigory and Kate and myself, as the ones who are trying to make this decision, interestingly, came down in quite different places on each of these questions. And we differed both in the weights that we assigned to different components of this model, and in our takes on the individual components themselves. And ultimately, each of us concluded that we did not think it made sense for Alvia to continue, so we were unanimous in the decision to wind things down, despite great differences of opinion about why exactly that seemed like the right call. And one thing that I really want to highlight, and that is quite an important takeaway for me from that process, is a reminder that ultimately projects are people, and projects are launched by and run by people who are making decisions not just about impact, though for many of us that's a huge portion of what we're aiming at, but who are making decisions about their lives and the sorts of things that they want to spend their time on, and the implications of that for their families and their livelihoods. And I think in many decisions, especially about things like wind downs of organizations, it's easy to slip into this mode of trying to really get the impact calculation perfect, and easy to slip into this mode of if the math checks out, the project continues. If it doesn't, the project stops. But I think this, to some extent, neglects the reality that these projects are like real people making decisions about their lives, often in like quite complex and idiosyncratic ways. And I think that we ultimately do a disservice to our pursuit of impact if we like neglect the extent to which this is just like a core reality of what it means to like take ambitious bets in this space. So yeah, ultimately, as I mentioned, we decided to wind things down with a tremendous amount of uncertainty still about whether that was exactly the right call and what sorts of things would happen or not happen in the world as a result. It's now been around a year since we shut things down, and for my part, at least, I think that this was absolutely the right decision. I'm able to look around now and see like all the things that previous Alvia team members have gotten up to, which to me are just like incredibly inspiring. Many of them are still working in biosecurity, some leading their own organizations and projects. Many of them are now working on AI safety and alignment from various angles, others in other spaces. And I feel like, incredibly grateful for all of them and for the work that they're doing now, and think that the world is much better for it. And overall, I am, despite the ultimate wind down, extremely grateful to have had the opportunity to take this shot. I think it was a well worthwhile thing to do. And just like full of gratitude for all of the people who came and worked at Alvia, the people who supported us in this community, financially and otherwise. And I'm very glad to be a part of a community that takes those kinds of bets and also is like accepting and gracious and open to the times when it makes sense to wind those down and move on to the next thing. So that's all for me, and let's bring everybody up for a panel.
Okay, thanks so much, all of you, for those stories. One question to ask first is, looking back on these projects, are there things you wish you did or encountered that could have helped you to fail faster or reach the conclusions you did? Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, part of it in the middle of the night as I think, oh God, what could I have done differently? And I think one thing that comes up is wishing we had gone more quickly from desk research to small tests in the field and implementing in the field. Because when we ultimately did a proof of concept, which was basically a small version of our project, there was so much that we learned from actually running things that we couldn't get to from desk research. And I think in EA in general, there's such a high regard for desk research, and I think desk research is great and super essential. But I do think that getting those small tests on the ground and then taking a moment after you've done those tests to be like, cool, does this change anything about how we think about the intervention rather than just barreling on? I think doing that sooner and taking the results more seriously would have helped us more quickly realize that things weren't working out in the way that we had expected.
Well, I feel it was very different in our case, actually, because with your charity, you really had to do the stuff, and then it just turned out it was not the thing to do. But in our case, we could have known that before we even started the campaign. So when the campaign was started, I was not even a member of Twarte Klatki. It was started by very experienced activists, in fact. It seemed to be a great idea for several reasons. One of them being that it seemed to be a very obvious thing to do, a very visible type of suffering, very easy to sell in media, very easy to get some reach, etc., etc. And it was also a low-hanging fruit. It seemed to be very possible to introduce a ban on live fish sales in Poland in a matter of just a few years. As I also mentioned, it was very easy to get supermarket chains to stop selling live fish. So it all seemed like, an obvious, easy, and very successful thing to do. And at that time, we failed to really think about how many animals will it affect. Is it really worth the resources? Do we really have the space for that in the organization? And throughout the first years of the campaign, it was conducted not by a person who was specialized in it. It was in fact coordinated by activists who worked on a very different topic for a majority of the year. So the coordinator who was there before me was working on chickens for 11 months of the year. Then just for December, she would switch to fish, just dropping the chickens entirely, and then going back to her main topic later. It was not very effective, especially given that there are way more chickens to help than carbs, right? So it kind of didn't make sense if we now think about it. So for me, firstly, we should just really think through what we're doing before we do that. That's the best time to do it. And then second thing, we should plan the end of the campaign before we even start it. So what's the goal to achieve? When is the campaign done? Are there any circumstances where like the major victories have been already achieved and there is no point continuing because there is nothing else effective that we could do? I think these are some questions that should be asked way before you take the first step in the actual campaign.
Yeah, maybe one brief thing that I would add there. In our case, I think one particular kind of missed opportunity was, as I mentioned, we started as a relatively near-term, kind of time-bounded sprint project, and then ended up kind of rolling that like relatively seamlessly into this longer-term goal of building a successful company. And I think that at that point in time, we did some kind of recalibration of like what our goals were. But I think that point in time when kind of the goal of what we were doing like changed in a significant way, like can and should have triggered like a much bigger like reevaluation of does our kind of team and mission and funding and everything actually kind of feed into the new like goal that we're pursuing. And I don't think that actually would have led to a wind down decision at the time, but I think that it would have led to like some big changes that would have like put us on a stronger trajectory and perhaps allowed us to fail faster as well.
It does seem that like reevaluation points are kind of a commonality with all of these, where hopefully, and maybe not as much as it should have been in your case, but hopefully you start and you think, this is a good idea, and that's why I'm going to do it. And then as you go about doing your project, you gather information about whether it's still a good idea. And I think one thing we struggled with, especially because this was an area that was new to us, I hadn't had prior experience in family planning, is that there were many moments where there would be some small thing, and I would say, I have this new piece of evidence. Is this still a good idea? And in many cases, it turned out the answer was yes. It's like I learned something new, and then I got more context, and it turned out it was still a good idea. And in order to avoid getting totally overwhelmed by that, I kind of stopped paying attention to those little nudges. And I think for us, what ultimately was helpful was saying, we're going to set up a reevaluation point and kind of write down in a doc, these are all of the little nudges I get. And then when you get to the reevaluation point, you look at it and you say, hey, that nudge doesn't seem useful anymore, but that one seems really important. And so it seems that when you sat down and started thinking about that nudge, that was kind of the critical thing that transformed it from just kind of a fear in the back of your head to actually being an actionable concern.
That's very true. And I also think it's very important to at least try to quantify the results. As I said, what really triggered the whole evaluation in our case was that we got this vision of creating an additional 1,700,000 fish per year. And even though in the end it was not the result why we shut down the campaign, because there were so many other reasons to do it, I think it was like a shock, that we needed to really take reevaluation as something that was needed and important at that time.
You mentioned evaluation points. If you kind of could do something like this again, would there be any kind of systems you'd recommend, like check-in points where you should like think holistically and anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your project timeline, right? But I don't think it's a bad idea to use as a rule of thumb, like every 6 months or every year you have a check-in. And obviously, I'm not trying to say that lots of organizations should shut down all the time, but I do think with projects, especially where you have an opportunity of, as it seemed to be with Anima, where it's like you didn't shut down the organization, you just like reallocated those resources. So that made it less stressful to say, hey, maybe at the end of the year, we're going to check in and have that point. So I think for my next project, I'd probably say every 6 months, every year, or after major milestones, when you really have that data that you can then act on, have that time where you get everyone who's involved in the project. Because I totally agree with what you were saying about, volunteers. In our case, it was also implementation partners on the ground, really getting their input, because I think that you don't just want it to be the big decision makers in a room. You want it to be the whole organization and other stakeholders as well, giving their input, because that's often where the key learning comes from.
That's very true. And I feel like it's important to engage people who are not working on this specific thing at the moment, because they might have some kind of like a fresh look. So in our case, we first consulted several experienced activists who were already in Otwarte Klatki. And then we, in fact, used some opinion from Aquatic Life Institute, so that they kind of looked at the facts and just confirmed that, yeah, in general, it seems to be a fair point that we should probably close the campaign. And it really helps to avoid the bias of being in a team. Because like one of the biggest challenges for me in shutting down a campaign is that it's something that you've been doing for a while. You spent a lot of time doing that. You built a team to do that. And you now need to tell your people, and you now need to tell yourself that it's time to end it, and that the last years or months have not been the best that you could have done in that time. So yeah, I think it's very valuable to include many points of view and many people's opinion in the process.
Yep, agreed on both counts.
You all talked about at various points, you mentioned like staring into the abyss or like the conversation with founders. What were those conversations like for you all? Weronika, you had an interesting answer in the green room earlier.
Well, yeah, actually, for me, there was no single difficult conversation throughout the whole process, which might sound surprising, right? But I think it's because it all happened very gradually. So at first, I spoke to my team about that, and it was at the stage of, let's think. It was not at the stage we're shutting down. So they were kind of included from the very beginning. Then I spoke to my supervisor, to her supervisor, etc. And it was like very gradual. It was not a decision that I had to, come and tell someone. It was not like a decision in a corporate environment when you need to fire someone and you come to this person and you say, look, you're fired, It's a hard thing to tell. But with my team, from the very beginning, I was like, look, we might not be doing the best job. Let's research that together. Let's think about that together. And I think with time, they just understood very well what's happening, and they understood that it was probably a good decision. A big point in dissolving the campaign was that we had very limited human resources at that time. So it was important to redirect them to other campaign teams so that they can use their experience for another cause. And each of them found another meaningful place for themselves in the organization. So I think this was also a key to really not leave them alone, but help them find a new role.
Yeah, for my part, there were many difficult conversations, both amongst and kind of internal to the company and our leadership team that, were like very difficult and like very personal in many ways, and required like a great amount of like courage and bravery for people to like speak their minds about like all sorts of different complicated factors that came into play in this decision. But I think like in general, having a like culture of like feedback and very like high trust, particularly like amongst our leadership team, like really helped facilitate that. And then, even once the decision kind of was made on our part, then, this meant a lot of very difficult conversations with, people on the team whose like lives and careers were like really affected by this, and like conversations with our investors who were like, of course, hoping to like make some money, and did not. But ultimately, I think the fact that we were able to have those conversations meant that we made this decision prior to like actually running out of money, and were able to help take care of the people who were leaving the organization, and ultimately like return some money to investors. Which the feedback that we got from that is like incredibly rare, and especially for startups, it's much more common for companies to completely run themselves into the ground before they're willing to admit that things might not be working. So ultimately, like having those very difficult conversations prior to them being strictly necessary in some financial sense, I think really helped us navigate that in a graceful fashion and preserve relationships, amongst the team and with our like investors and supporters.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a very different kind of approach or vibe to these conversations, depending on how like at what level it's happening. As a whole company, there you had like more of a campaign. You could move to a different campaign, I'm curious, Sarah, if you had, how are those conversations for you?
Yeah, unfortunately, I agree that it was more on the painful side. I think part of that's probably due to the fact that we were both sort of shutting down the whole organization rather than just shifting to a different project. I will say I really appreciated how civil and how empathetic all the conversations were. So I think the fact that my co-founder and I were both super aligned on like, we're here for the impact, you know, we're not here for this project. You're always invested in a project when you've been throwing so much of yourself into it. But I actually think the fact that we came in at it through the AIM program, where we signed up and we said, we want to do impactful projects. And we think this intervention is an example of an impactful project. But it wasn't like I had been thinking about family planning for a decade and this was, you know, the result of like so much thinking and care. I think for me, and for both of us, as soon as we felt that it was no longer maximally impactful, it was no longer the same kind of thing to us. So I think that helped a lot. And I will say I was honestly surprised by how understanding and kind our donors were. I had these anxieties in my mind that they would say, I'm so disappointed, you totally ruined all of this money, you know, it could have been sent to AMF and save all these lives, but instead it was wasted. But I think our donors had the correct mindset of, you know, we took a bet and we did this because we thought it was a bet, and just because one bet doesn't work out doesn't mean it was wrong to take that bet. And I think we were right to take this bet, and for whatever reason, all of our donors were like, yep, we were taking a bet, we're happy with it, we're proud of you, cool, go do something else. And I think that made a difference, really. And so even though it was super painful in the sense of feeling like we had personally failed in some ways just because it's your project and it's your baby and you're sad, the fact that so many people involved were understanding and had a bet space mindset, I think made it a lot easier and a lot more doable.
You've all mentioned some really nice things there. You mentioned kind of being part of a community that accepts failure, your donors who took it really well. Is there more we can do here to, in this community, embrace failure, embrace like lessons like this?
Well, I believe it's very, very important to share your insights on why you think it's important to shut this specific action. As I said, we did that by writing an article, and it reached quite many people in effective altruism community. And even after I spoke about the exact topic on another conference, one person from another organization conducting the same campaign approached me and said, look, you have some valid point, and we will reevaluate the campaign. So I think it's important because there might have been another organization working the same way as yours who wouldn't even realize it's possible that it's not effective before they heard of your case, right? And we need to learn from failures, and it's best if we don't learn from our own failures, but, you know, learn from others as well.
Yeah, I agree with that to some extent. Like, I do think that it is important to like share as much as possible, and I think it's really useful to think about like what are the lessons that can be taken away from things. But I think part of my motivation, and you're mentioning the point that I made earlier around like organizations kind of ultimately being people, is that I think that there are some projects that don't make sense to continue for reasons that can't be like neatly traced back to back of the envelope calculation, and I think that there like needs to be kind of an openness to the kind of full complexity of factors that can come to play in those scenarios, because if the only acceptable reason for shutting something down is if you can run the math and persuade everybody else of that, then I think there's lots of projects that don't make sense to have running that would nonetheless have a hard time winding down.
I do think that just talking about when your project fails, maybe you can't always share all the details, or maybe, the answer isn't always going to be our CEA wasn't good enough. Sometimes it's going to be we didn't get along, or we decided we wanted to do something else, or we decided to have kids. And I think, accepting that those are valid reasons, and that, it shouldn't be your job to like start a project and then you have to run it forever. Like our whole ecosystem is just better off if people end projects gracefully. And so I think ending projects gracefully, I think being transparent about when you're doing that and why you're doing that wherever possible. I think you're totally right that helps because it helps people share learnings. And I think it just helps set a norm and a tone where we understand that things don't always work out.
We have time for one final question, so a brief answer from each of you would be great on what are you most proud of looking back over these projects?
Yeah, for me, it's like by an overwhelming margin, like the kind of learning and growth and development that like Alvia helped facilitate for the people who worked there. Yeah, like it feels just like an enormous honor and privilege to have played, some small role in, helping people along in their careers, and in some cases, helping people go from being like early career individual contributors to 18 months later being like very high-powered like managers and directors who are now in an excellent position to like run their own teams and organizations, and that continues to be just like a huge inspiration to me.
Well, I think I'm proudest of my team at that time, because I was 20 at the situation when it all was unrolling. It was my first ever time to coordinate like a project. It was my first ever time to handle a situation like that. And looking back, I could have done some things better. But despite some mistakes on my side, the team just went very well with the changes. And there were no major conflicts, no major, as I said, difficult conversations to have. So I think the fact that the whole team that was engaged in the campaign was fine with closing it and was like mature enough to accept that, I think it's fantastic of them. And yeah, it was a dream team for sure. Yeah.
We didn't reach as many people as we'd wanted to, and it didn't have the end-line impacts that we wanted it to, but we were still able to reach thousands of women at about 18 hospitals and health centers in northern Ghana with information about their family planning options. So I know that for some of them, that helped them make different decisions, that helped inform them, and I'm proud that we were able to do that.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I don't think we're hitting diminishing returns on questions here, but we're out of time. But there will be office hours in Balkan after this. But thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for their projects and their time today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.